So thanks for having me. Been a really interesting day of talks. You might be wondering why someone from a computer science department is talking about political philosophy. My first degree was in philosophy, and then since moving into more technical areas, I've tried to keep up an interest in it. And so when I saw all the research that was coming out of this community, it was really exciting for me. So I wanted to try and draw some connections between those two different research areas. So we've been talking a lot over the last few days and over recent years about what it would mean for a machine learning model to be fair, right? So there have been a few different proposed metrics, right? So I've got a few here, but apparently there are now at least 21 which have been discussed. So you've got things like your model should be equally accurate on different populations, or maybe it's about equalizing false positive rates. Maybe it's about counterfactual fairness. So a model that gave a decision to a woman should give the same decision that it would have given had she been born a man. That's another one of the more interesting ones, which I haven't heard discussed much today. But all of these are less definitions of fairness, in my eyes. At least they're not the kind of definitions that you would find in an encyclopedia or in a dictionary. And so I think to dig deeper into why it is that fairness is controversial, we have to look elsewhere. And so one place that we can look is in political philosophy. And so I'm not the first person to make these connections. Many of the seminal works in this area have referred to work of political philosophy. For instance, Dwork et al. Paper from 2012 did refer to John Rawls and Roma and other philosophers not named John. And a few different papers have made similar connections, right? But what I haven't really seen is like a systematic mapping of the connections between these different research areas. And I can't claim to be completely systematic in this paper, but it's an attempt to get there, right? And so I think what this could helpfully do is point us towards not answers, but complicated debates that might help clarify some of the complications that are arising in the debates that we're having, and maybe also raise new challenges that we could try and tackle. I should also just mention that, so given the background I have quite a limited range of knowledge. It's mostly kind of Western Anglo-American analytic philosophy, which is only a small slice of the entire philosophical literature, but nonetheless, it does have some interesting things to say, I think, about these topics. So first of all, I want to dig into the literature on discrimination, and we were very, very lucky to have Professor Hellman here this morning talking about these issues. And so what I'm going to try and do in the next two slides is a gross oversimplification of the debates that were raised this morning. Basically, the question is, what is discrimination? What makes it wrong, right? And so there are various different accounts that we heard this morning. And one set of accounts is talking about the intentional states or the emotional states of decision makers who are responsible for allocating outcomes to people, right? And so this is the kind of, I think the keynote this morning subbed this up as it's the thought that counts view, right? So this is about whether the decision maker has certain intentions or feelings of animosity or differential sympathy towards different groups. And really this is an account of kind of classical human-to-human discrimination, right? It's not dealing with structural discrimination where it's the way that an institution is set up results in disparities. It's really talking about the mental states of people. And for that reason, it's potentially not a very useful framework for thinking about algorithmic forms of discrimination, for the simple reason that machine learning models don't have mental states, right? And they certainly don't have mental states like contempt or animosity or disrespect. As much as data scientists, we might sometimes anthropomorphize them in that way. So a couple of exceptions to this, though. You might think a data scientist who did have these kinds of intentions might be, might thereby impart those kinds of discrimination to the models that they build intentionally. Maybe more likely, there might be the people who created the training data that the model is trained on may have had those kinds of mental states, and thereby we might think about the model inheriting those from the training data. Okay, but apart from those kind of exceptions, I think this isn't a very helpful account of discrimination, even though it is quite a potentially good one when it comes to describing discrimination between humans, right? So another account that is sometimes proposed as an account of discrimination is that it violates the notion that people should be treated as individuals. So if you're inferring things about people on the basis of their membership in a group, a generalization about that group, then you're essentially punishing them for the behavior that they haven't committed, but the behavior of other people in that group may have committed. And so for economists, this is like been shown to be like a rational thing for a firm to do to maximize its profits, but most of us have problems with it, at least for certain kinds of groups. So one of the problems with this view, and I think it was alluded to earlier, is that it's too broad on its own. It doesn't distinguish why certain groups it's okay to discriminate on and others it's not. And there's another worry that, can we really get away from generalization, right? We can make a more precise form of generalization. So you could make a test that was more and more precise, but there will always be some people who are going to be, unless your test is 100% perfect, there are always going to be some people who perform better on the job or than you'd expect given an employment screening test, for instance, and vice versa. So if you want to talk about generalization being the problem, then it kind of rules out a lot of things that we do in everyday life. And especially for machine learning, which is kind of like generalization on steroids, then it kind of rules out the whole enterprise, right? So, there are these those are two broad classes of accounts of discrimination, which I've kind of grossly oversimplified, but I think neither really help us to get to the nub of some of the controversies we're talking about here. So I think for that, it's useful to look at broader debates about egalitarianism. So egalitarianism, roughly speaking, there's lots of different variants of it, but generally if you try and boil it down, it's about A, people should be treated equally, and B, sometimes the claim that certain valuable things should be distributed in some sense equally, right? And there's a debate about the extent to which discrimination is reducible to egalitarianism, or maybe they're really just disjoint things. But I'm not going to go into that here, because I think we can draw conclusions from both literatures, regardless of the relationship between them. I should also mention that, as a terminological point, egalitarians often talk about egalitarian justice. And I think the point was well made this morning that there's a difference between fairness and justice, right? So fairness being essentially a comparative notion. It's only fair relative to the treatment of some other person. And I think that's a good distinction to draw. But unfortunately, a lot of work in egalitarianism talks about egalitarian justice, which I think generally is a comparative notion, right? So it's always something, if you're looking at inequalities, it's always about comparisons between groups. So just to be aware, if I say egalitarian justice, or if you read that, it's not necessarily talking it's probably talking in a comparative way. Okay, so one of the major debates in egalitarianism concerns how we make comparisons. So if we're saying that different outcome classes are good or bad, and we're making trade-offs between different outcome classes, it's kind of helpful if we have a single metric that we can compare things to. So if we're talking about someone getting a job or someone getting put in jail, we want to have some way to compare these things and to make judgments about the relative merits or demerits of them. And so there's been different arguments about what this fundamental egalitarian currency should be. And so some people think it's about welfare, so people like Cohen. Others say it's about resources, so income or assets. Others say it's about capabilities, so it's about the equal ability to do things in life. And then other people emphasize things like political status, so the ability to participate in a democracy and have one's voice heard, and so on. And so there are these different metrics or different currencies of egalitarianism, and if we're thinking in different, if we have different assumptions about what those are, we might end up kind of disagreeing about things. But to make matters more complicated, it might also be that there's no single egalitarian currency which applies across different contexts, but rather there might be different spheres of justice. And so someone like Michael Walzer puts forward the kind of pluralist notion that in different spheres of society there may be different currencies of egalitarian justice, and that if you try to compensate a loss in one sphere with a gain in another, that's not really an appropriate thing to do. So, for instance, it wouldn't be right to trade off the ability to vote in an election for some economic benefit. And so to give you examples of these contexts, so if we're talking about democratic rights, there might be a logic of fairness that says everybody should have exactly the same rights, right? It shouldn't matter how enthusiastic you are when you go to the ballot box. Everyone should have the right to vote. Whereas in cases like professional positions, you might have more of an equality of opportunity logic of fairness, right? And then there might be cases where we're not sure where a social policy or practice resides. So, for instance, punishment is one that's frequently contains many different potential logics of fairness. So one might be, punishment is about retrospective punishment for the crime that was committed. Others might say it's really just incarceration is there to prevent harm to the public. And these two different logics of fairness are kind of going to create disagreements between people. And so this kind of applies in the machine learning context. If we're deploying a model in a particular context, we kind of want to have an idea about what the sphere of justice is, what the currency is that's valid in that sphere. And so, if we're talking about a job hiring algorithm, it might be appropriate to employ some notion of equality of opportunity. And if we are, say, looking at an airport screening algorithm, it might be more appropriate to have complete parity of impacts between nationalities or religions or so on, as part of a sense of social solidarity. Another major debate in egalitarianism concerns the role of choices that people make in the unequal positions that they find themselves in. So one answer that is provided by a position called luck egalitarianism is essentially the notion that people shouldn't be made comparatively worse off than others through things that were just bad luck, so things that they had no control over. Whereas if people have voluntarily chosen to put themselves in a worse off position and they have autonomy and they understand the risks, then maybe there's less of a case for compensation or redistribution in those cases. And so it might be instructive to think here about the Compass risk recidivism scoring context. One of the things that was problematic about that was that it used attributes that people hadn't meaningfully chosen, right? So one of the attributes was number of arrests in the family, right? Which is generally not something that someone has control over. So this kind of suggests, this luck egalitarian position suggests a simple rule of thumb, which might be check all of the features in your model and make sure that every one of them is something that you could defensively say is something that people chose, right? I think there are some good critiques of the luck egalitarian position. Just one of them is the notion that some choices that people make in a free and autonomous way, they might not deserve to bear the cost of those choices. So, for instance, feminist critique of this position is that if you're choosing to not take a well-paid full-time job in order to care for a family member, for instance, then that might be a kind of choice that we want to protect from negative consequences. So these kinds of costly rescues might complicate the picture, that just because you have a variable that for some people is a free choice, it might not always be the case that we want to allow them to suffer the consequences of making that free choice. So another important concept which comes up in the egalitarian justice literature is that inequalities in and of themselves may not be morally problematic, but rather the moral problem problem arises because of how the inequalities themselves came about. And this is what Derek Parfit calls Deontic justice. So if you imagine two alien planets which have no contact with each other, one's better off than the other, that isn't going to raise the same kind of egalitarian concerns that we have in a world that's interconnected, where people are doing things and behaving in certain ways that create unjust kind of inequalities. And so this is really where philosophy ends, and other disciplines like history or sociology or economics come in to offer explanations based on data about how these things come up. But I think it's a useful frame to have, and so it allows us to kind of consider things about the generalizations that we rely on when we're using machine learning, for instance. So Casper Lippert Rasmussen has this argument that if you've got say a risk scoring algorithm, right, which is based on membership in a protected class, and that membership in that protected class is a good proxy for something of interest, right? We can't just take that statistical fact as a justification for different impacts. And the reason is because we have to consider the social processes that make that fact obtain. Unlike in natural sciences, where generally the rules, the laws that we're uncovering are seen to be independent of human intervention. In these cases, there are social processes that are the result of people acting in certain ways. And so we have to consider why it is that a certain protected class might be a predictor of something of interest. And so really it's about considering what the majority or what society or what certain actors do or fail to do that make those statistical facts obtain. And that helps us to focus on questions of responsibility as well, which are slightly different to questions of unfairness, because it might be that the organization that's implementing this model maybe has a duty to avoid compounding the injustice, but they certainly aren't going to be fully responsible for the underlying injustice itself. And so that prompts questions of where we place the burden of responsibility. Finally, I think there's an interesting distinction to be drawn between distributive and representational egalitarianism or justice. So these notions come into play when we're thinking about the representation of different cultures, identities, languages in cultural artifacts. And so while it's true that cultural artifacts do have an effect on how we perceive ourselves and each other, I think the paper on Bollywood movies is a very good example of this. There's also a sense in which a cultural artifact which doesn't represent certain values that we would like it to represent is in and of itself problematic. And that's the representational fairness issue that I think it drives that intuition. And so there are debates about the relationship between these two things. Again, philosophers disagree about whether you can reduce all representational damage to, or representational harms to distributive harms and vice versa. But I think this is quite a useful distinction to keep in mind. And if you think about some of the recent work that's been done in this space, think about the case of the gender bias in word embeddings. So word embeddings essentially place words in a language on a point in a high-dimensional space, and they allow us to say things like, well, the transformation from the word man into the word woman is the same transformation as that from king to queen, but problematically, it's also the same transformation that turns programmer into homemaker or doctor into nurse. Right? And so these things are damaging potentially because they result in different harms between groups, between actual people, but also because they represent something that we don't like. And so there's interesting work on that space. There's also kind of related work on fair rankings, which is about ensuring that there are kind of parity of different groups represented in search results, but also awards or recommendations and so on. So I think it's useful to keep this distinction in mind when we're talking about fairness issues. Not all fairness issues immediately and directly reduce to harms to specific people. How much time have I got? Oh, 30 seconds. Okay, sorry. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. Hopefully that's good. Oh, Oh, sorry. Cool.